a lot of what happens across the world this year depends on the outcome and the future course of the war between Ukraine and Russia. Ishaan Tharoor, your sense of where this battle, the war, goes from here? We're seeing the war continue month after month with no immediate sign of closure. Is that the way it's likely to stay through the year?
All signs indicate yes. And, you know, talking about what India does but as the head of the G20 this year, if you talk to the Indonesians, the war in Ukraine really upset the apple cart for them in terms of their ambitions for the G20 presidency. This is, as you said, a war that has consumed the Western imagination for obviously understandable reasons in many cases. But when it comes to India's interests, and when it comes to the interests of a country like Indonesia, where when they took the mantle of the G20, this was a moment for them to really assert themselves on the world stage in a certain way. This is a multicultural Southeast Asian democracy that has a view of the world that they thought they could bring to bear, and it was completely swept aside by the polarization created by the war in Ukraine. And, you know, that very well may be the case as we watch India take the mantle of G20 leadership. It's not clear what conditions could arise at this point that could lead to a meaningful process of political settlement. And it's not clear where the political will is to push those conditions. And certainly, you know, you saw the Indonesians try to broker something that wasn't particularly meaningful. I doubt that India has any further capacity as well to play a major role on this in the global context. So this is a war that will continue to create ruptures, that will continue to drain economies, and that the U.S. will probably continue to bankroll in months to come.
Gideon, we're also seeing NATO countries arm Ukraine with the kind of weapon systems they earlier said were off the table. To what extent does that increase the prospect of NATO getting further dragged into this war? Do you agree with Ishaan where he says it will continue in the same vein? Could it get much worse before it gets better?
Well, I mean, I think you're right. There's been a gradual shift. And I think that at the beginning, the NATO countries, and particularly the US, were very conscious of the risk of nuclear war, frankly. They were very worried that Putin would use a nuclear weapon, and they restrained what kind of stuff they were giving. Now you're seeing the British, for example, giving Challenger tanks to the Ukrainians and hoping that the Germans, who have actually many more attackers, these Leopards, will follow up. And I think it's not that there's no longer concern about Russian escalation, but less. And I tend to agree with Ishaan that it looks like a kind of stalemate and a deadlock, but if you talk to some of the Western folk about, well, what is their game plan? Their view is that if the Ukrainians can make rapid gains with some of this new equipment in the spring, that maybe you can get it to the point where Putin does decide there has to be peace talks. That would be easy for either side, because the Ukrainians will want to push on to Crimea. I don't think actually the West would back them in that. They'd put pressure on them behind the scenes. But whether
it could also lead to an under pressure Putin wanting to escalate further.
Well, exactly. And again, I think there's a slight division of opinion. I think the Americans are a bit more cautious than the Europeans, actually. But the Americans provide all the money and all the weapons, not all of it, but the bulk of it. So even if the Europeans are saying to the Americans behind the scenes, you know, come on guys, you can be a bit harder, it's actually the caution in the White House which is setting the tone.